Okay. What kind of a body condition score are we talking about with those cattle today? Body conditions, does anybody do body condition scoring in their cow herd? I mean, you probably don't call it that, but you're probably doing that every day when you're looking at your cattle and going, man, she's getting kind of thin. In my world, so that I can calibrate myself with other veterinarians and have producers start to calibrate themselves, we look at a group of cows and we give them a score from 1 to 9. 1 is that flat thing that's has no tissue in it laying in the bottom of a pasture somewhere. So you don't want to see 1s unless you've got a bone pile. But most of these cows in this pen are somewhere between 4 and 4 plus, maybe even a 3 plus. And what we're doing is we're looking at the amount of fat covering the back along the spine, and we're looking at the transverse processes of the vertebrae in the flank area. And when we see a big sunken in area under the transverse processes, so that we can actually count them and the ribs, that's a 3 plus to a 4 cow. You want your cows to be a 5. It's okay to be a 4.5 when you're raising a calf, because you're putting your energy into your calf. But if you're going to get bred back and calve next year, somewhere that year you have to pick that body condition score back up again. And that's what Roger was talking about when you're talking about letting your pastures regroup for the next year. Your cows have to regroup for the next year. And I think it was Larry also was talking about the fact that, you know, those cows are going to have, or maybe it was Davey, you got to have your cows be able to get their condition back. So when he was talking about early weaning. Some of the things, so that's what's on everybody's mind right now is my cow's body condition scores, what kind of condition are my calves in, how am I going to get, you know, cows marketed. You know, this is what we're seeing, and this is the stuff that draws our attention and gets us thinking about all the trauma related with surviving a drought. Some of the stuff that you don't think about are some of the health conditions that I wanted to bring up today. Now, we heard about toxic plants. Has anyone here had a toxic plant problem in the past? What was your toxic plant problem?
We had acorn problems.
Okay.
We also had problems with the plants that are along the highway. Oleanders.
Okay. All right. And who in your cow herd is going to eat a toxic plant? When is a cow going to select a toxic plant to eat? When they're starving and they don't have. Are there going to be differences in your herd? I mean, does everybody have any feelings about some cows being more aggressive and assertive than other cows? Okay, because we're going to go look at some cows down here, and we got one that's a body condition score 6 and another one right next to her that's about a 3. So how does that happen in a herd? Because somebody is getting more groceries than somebody else. And that especially can happen in feeding situations. Pardon?
The number 6 is from my family.
Yeah. So cows that are most at risk for starving, the cows that are doing the least well out there might be who in your herd? Less dominant cows? Who might that be? Your younger cows or your older cows? So we'll talk about how we can fix that in the future. So toxic plants, we talked about acorn toxicity. That's going to be a problem right now. I know there are some people here who are more versed in oak tree development and growth than I am, but there are some people who feel like drought years, the oak tree sheds more acorns. It's a stress reaction. And the bad news for cattlemen is that in a year when you may have toxicity, there may be actually more acorns out there for them to eat. So that's something to be concerned about. We also have oak buckeye ball toxicity. One is a liver toxin, the other one is a neurotoxin. People will often call me as a veterinarian and say, how can you they're describing symptoms over the phone. Can you tell me what that is, Doc? And I'm like, it's a sick cow. If you're going to look at a cow who's got a liver problem or a nerve toxin problem, you're not going to know from her staggering around out in the field which one it is. And those diagnoses are most often made on the pathology floor, because once those things have developed, there's really no way to fix them. The other problem with the acorns is going to be calves developing improperly. And you'll have calves with birth defects next fall from eating those. One of the other things that I'm concerned about is water quality during drought situations. And Larry was talking about, or somebody was talking about pastures fertilizing. Water reservoirs that some people are hauling water. Anybody here hauling water right now? Okay, a lot of clients of mine are hauling water too. those reservoirs dry up, a lot of the solids in the water get concentrated. So we're thinking they don't have water, but they actually may be drinking water that's really low quality towards the end of the period that they're on those reservoirs. So most of us start hauling water a little bit too late in the game. Our cows are drinking those high sulfate waters. They're starting not to want to eat as well. And that's another thing that you could jump in a little bit earlier. I think we're all optimistic that we're always going to get rain, and so we put off making some of these decisions like culling and hauling water and supplementing later when we've already got some issues associated with it. We also can be irrigating pastures and having runoff from cattle feces and from fertilizers into water sources that can increase the nitrates, and so you can get a nitrate toxicity problem with your water supply. I'm going to refer to some notes here because there's just a lot of time. Okay, anaplasmosis and foothill abortion. Anybody have problems with that on their ranch? John, I know, does. Okay, what do we know about anaplasmosis immunity and how you prevent outbreaks in a herd? They need to get exposed. If you run in country that has the ticks, the Ixodes ticks that spread anaplasmosis or is the vector for it, they need to get exposed as calves to develop immunity. Does that sound familiar to everybody? So what happens if that's a wet season tick and you don't have a wet season? They don't get exposed. So we had from October until now, when that tick should have been active, biting young, growing baby calves and getting them some immunity, and the tick wasn't active. Now, we may get enough rain over the next 2 or 3 months, 60 days, to get that tick active and get some cases of anaplasm in your replacement heifers. That's really all we care about, right? We don't care about your steers. They're going to be going down the road. But in your replacement heifers, we might not. We might not get enough wet season to have a good active tick season. So we have some choices that we can make. We have an anaplasmosis vaccine that's live from Poultry Health Laboratories that can be given to your weaned heifers so that you can have them immune for the next year in a carrier state. We also have a killed vaccine that's marketed through the Cattlemen's Association. Both of them operate on the same principle, the live and the killed. The killed is just more expensive and requires a booster shot. The live is one vaccine. And John, you've been using that now for a couple years, haven't you? Has it helped with your... So they had intermittent exposure on their ranch even during normal rain years. So to correct the problem of having heifers with no immunity, they started vaccinating them as weaned heifers, and they have had no problems. So those are two tools that are available to you. We think once they have a carrier state, they're going to go out and get bit by ticks and continue to keep their carrier state. So even if you use the kill vaccine and you have to use 2 boosters in that first year, you're not going to have to use that every other year for the rest of their lives. Usually after 2 seasons, they should have gotten bit and have their own natural carrier state. Does that make sense? So some of the diseases associated with feeding cattle, I have a big producer in my area that has always calved his spring calves out on native feed. This year he's not going to be able to do that, so he's going to keep them on his lowland permanent pastures, which look like everyone else's this right now, and he's going to be feeding a lot of hay. So the problem with his situation is he's going to have a bunch of baby calves crowded into permanent pastures feeding hay every day. What's that going to do to the calves? What are you going to see? What kind of problem? Calf diarrhea. So what can he do to prevent that? Well, if he can use the sandhill technique for sorting off the older calves from the younger calves. So what you do is every week or 2 weeks you go through, you're going to take your cows that have already calved with their calves and move them into another pasture, take the fresh ones to a new pasture. So you leave your older calves on the calving pasture, you take your cows that are still going to calve and move them to a fresh piece of ground. If you could do like Roger said and maybe strip a calving pasture into some strips with electric fence, you might be able to do it that way. Sometimes electric fencing is tough with baby calves because they can get on the wrong side of it and cause a big problem. But it would be one way that you could diminish the problem associated with having a bunch of older calves exposing younger calves to calf diarrhea. Calf diarrhea is a normal viral exposure between 2 and 3 months of age. They're big enough by that time they can get it and get over it. But if you have a 3-month-old calf with diarrhea right next to a 10-day-old calf, that's when you can get a diarrhea that they cannot survive. So that's a consideration. We talked about quality water. When you're talking about deficiencies associated with the drought, you're talking about quality water, number one. Everything else. I talked to a gal this morning. She said, we're thinking of using selenium boluses. We thought maybe that would be a good idea because we have no feed. Obviously, if you have no hay, you're not going to have any selenium going in either. I said, that's a good idea, but for your baby calves, you might be better off using a selenium and vitamin E injection. Vitamin E and A and D are in fresh green growing pasture. You don't have any of that. So our calves right now are probably pretty low in vitamin E and A and D. That's a pretty cheap solution. A bottle of Muci for a calf is going to cost about 50 cents to $1 per calf. AD and E is about 10 to 15 cents per calf. So if you're branding your calves still from the fall, it would be a great idea to think about getting a vitamin A, D, and E on board because that's going to be deficient. Hey Jerry, can you grab a water for me out of my pickup? Okay. So we talked about toxicities. This isn't going to be anything we're up against right now, especially with the rain. Obviously, the way to solve a drought is to prepare a drought talk. And if we had just had this in October, we wouldn't even have to be here today.
You're a month late.
Yeah. Blue-green algae toxicity. Anybody had problems with that? Okay. Ponds in the fall, traditionally, with a lot of evaporation with hot weather, will concentrate a fungal development or an algae on the top 2 inches of the water. So I have a picture of it here. I have some cattle in a permanent pasture system that on fall days, when we get a north wind, it'll blow all the algae that's on that top 2 inches of the pond to one side. Unfortunately, that one side was the only access the cattle had to the water. So they drank the top 2 inches. It caused an acute liver toxicity. Their skin sloughed off, their livers looked bad, and they died. If we continue to have dry conditions, I mean, we're going to have 60 days of rain and we'll have some grass, but we're going to have a drier year. How many of you went to the Cattlemen's convention in Reno this November? Did you go to the climate talk?
I didn't.
Okay. Guys from Colorado meteorologist said, make no mistake, this is a 3 to 10 year drought cycle. We will have the normal patterns. Thank you so much, Bob. We will have the normal pattern. That's what we're having today. We're having our normal pattern. We just won't have the volume. So we could end up with some real dry, hot weather going into the summertime. So be thinking of your stock ponds and microcystis algae toxicity because that can be a problem. What can you do to fix it? Make multiple access sites in your pond for cattle. In this case, they only had one. You can also put pumps in the water or sprinklers on the top that disturb the surface. If you disturb the surface, that algae doesn't clump right on those top 2 inches where the cattle go in and drink from. Supplements, I think, were talked about somewhat today already this morning, and we'll talk about them some more this afternoon. But we talked about if you're eating a whole bunch of dry feed that doesn't have any protein, the cows are filling their gut up trying to get the protein. The protein is the limiting factor. So what's going to happen is those cows can get a rumen impaction. What does a rumen impaction look like? It looks like a cow that doesn't have any room to eat very much anymore. So the appetite goes way down. The cow's body condition gets even worse. The cows will start to get evidence of fat shrinking from behind their eyes with a sunken in eye. and they'll feel miserable, and it will take about 25 days. There's no cure for that unless you do surgery to remove the rumen infection. So when you start seeing cows that are having those kinds of problems, it's too late. We already heard today. If you're feeding dry hay, coarser quality feed like rice straw, corn stalks, make sure you've got some protein out there so those cattle can utilize that dry feed, okay, to prevent rumen impaction. You can use many of the protein supplement blocks use salt to regulate the amount of feed that cattle will take in. If you overuse those, they're again in that situation where they're on a supplement block, but they don't have enough dry roughage to add to that protein supplement, they can be so hungry they'll overeat the supplement and end up with ammonia toxicity from the amount of protein that's in there. So talk to your veterinarian or your extension agent and make sure that the amount of protein in that block is appropriate for the level of protein and the feed. And we talked about that already this morning. I've also had people with molasses blocks where they are regulated by salt or protein, but they overconsumed the molasses and ended up with a lactic acidosis or a rumen acidosis. So those are some things that can happen if you're throwing supplements out there, but you're not really paying attention to what all you're feeding them. So it's just good to be aware and ask questions. You can be buying supplemental feeds that then shed weeds on your property. That's where you're not thinking about this year. You got to think about next year too. I had a gal that was so excited that she bought a bunch of Caltrans prepared bales that had star thistle in them. So try not to make those kinds of decisions because you're just going to set yourself up for more problems. Okay, so you guys need to go. Okay.
Please take a handout. This handout's right over here, okay?
Real just quick. You're talking about body score and stuff, and I'm going traveling around the country, and I see a lot of cows that are moving into that 3-2 area. What's the chance of recovery for those cattle?
You know, when you're already in that shape, the talk that we had just before this one when they were talking about culling, you got to cull them. You got to be looking honestly at your situation and culling them at a 4. You know, they're not going to recover from that. Not this year. Those cows are going to be going into their next calving. I had some cattle come out of Oregon like that. They had been in a forest situation. They were coming out of Oregon in really poor condition. They were all bred. I said, well, you learned one thing. You learned that your cattle have fertility because they all got bred under extremely harsh conditions. But if you don't feed them now, they are not going to make it next year. They will have protein deficient calves with bad immune systems. They won't get rebred next year because they're going to be going into the next calving season in a deficit. Cut your loss. Be a predator. Don't be sentimental. I had a guy that didn't want to send cows, pairs to the sale because they had baby calves and they were going to sort the baby calves off the cows. Boo-hoo. Get them off your property. You know, you're not doing them any favors. Cull like a predator. I've been saying that for 30 years. Do it now. This is exactly why you cull as a predator, because you don't want to go bankrupt feeding cattle. And one word, and I'll shut up, about your bulls. If you like a bull and he's only been on your ranch for 2 years and you want to get 1 more year out of him, bull test him right now, and if he's no good, he goes down the road. You're going to spend $1,500 to $1,800 feeding that bull from right now until August. And you're going to say to me, oh my God, those bulls are going to cost me $5,000. You're going to spend $1,800 feeding them. You know, you're going to get $2,000 for selling them. You can afford that $5,000 bull in August. Put it in a CD till you have to go buy your bull. Okay.